Hunger. It is the most primal instinct, a command inscribed in every cell of life. It is the drive that drives the beast of prey and sows the seed in the farmer. For most of us, it is a familiar companion, a whisper that can be soothed with a meal. But what happens when that whisper turns into a roar that never ends? What happens when hunger becomes not a need, but an identity, a curse? What happens when it becomes a bottomless abyss that dwells within a person, devouring everything in its path: food, morality, and ultimately humanity itself? To answer that question, we must go back to France in the late 18th century, a society seething on the brink of the revolution. Amidst injustice and poverty, in a countryside near Lyon, a creature was born around 1772. History does not tell us his birth name. It calls him by only one name, a name that will forever be recorded in the pages of the most bizarre medical literature: TARRARE. Even as a teenager, TARRARE was an anomaly. He was a slight, gaunt man, but that was about as normal as it got. His appearance was marked by something otherworldly. His hair was unusually thin and soft, but his mouth was unnaturally wide. Doctors later recorded that when he opened his mouth, a space the size of 12 eggs could be seen without distorting his face. His lips were almost non-existent, revealing teeth that were badly yellowed and damaged from constant grinding. When he wasn't eating, his body was a bizarre sight. His skin was unusually loose, especially around his belly. He could pull the excess skin from his belly and wrap it around his waist. But when he was full, that belly would swell up like a giant, inflated balloon. And then there was the smell. Medical text by Baron Dominique Ginlary, one of the greatest surgeons of Napoleon's time, described TARRARE as emitting a stench so strong that it was unbearable within 20 paces. The smell, it was said, could be seen as a vapor rising from his body after every meal. He sweated constantly, his body always in a state of heat. But all those physical abnormalities were nothing compared to his hunger. It was not the hunger of a normal person. It was an abyss. As a teenager, TARRARE could eat a quarter of a cow in a single day, a mass of meat equal to his own weight. His family, poor peasants, could not sustain such a hunger. They did the only thing they could. They sent him away. Rejected by the first society he knew, his family, TARRARE, began a life of wandering. He wandered France, following pilgrims, thieves, and prostitutes, doing anything to fill his belly. He scavenged through garbage dumps, fought with wild animals for food, and quickly realized that his deformity, his suffering, could also be a means of survival. He began performing. He became a monster for entertainment. But those performances and the food he had to eat to survive would only be the beginning of a journey deeper and deeper into darkness, where the line between man and beast would blur. The answer, in 18th century France, was the stage. But not the stage of the courtly plays. It was the stage of the streets, of the markets, a chaotic world where life and death, the divine and the hideous, were on display for entertainment. It was the last refuge for society's outcasts. A bearded woman conjoined twins, and now a young man with a demonic hunger. TARRARE had found his new family. He joined a traveling circus, working under the tutelage of a quack, a drug dealer, and a trickster. TARRARE's role was simple. He was a human trash can. To attract the crowd's attention, the quack would challenge them to throw anything at TARRARE, and he would swallow it. At first, it was harmless stuff. A basket full of apples, which he ate in a few minutes, or dozens of raw eggs. The crowd laughed and applauded. But human curiosity has a dark side. They want to see more. They want to see boundaries broken. And TARRARE, in exchange for a piece of bread or a few coins, was willing to oblige. He began to swallow the inedible. Corks, pebbles, keys, even a pocket watch, all disappeared in his wide mouth, and then came out almost intact. His performance was an open challenge to nature, a slow self-destruction for fun. During this period, TARRARE learned an important and bitter lesson. The disgust of others was his ticket to his next meal. The horror in their eyes was his guarantee of survival. He turned his curse into a profession, a twisted performance art. But his stomach demanded more than stones. His hunger was for flesh and blood, and his performance quickly escalated to a new level of horror. Historical accounts detail the scene that became legendary about TARRARE. Surrounded by a curious crowd, he was presented with a live cat. Picture the scene. TARRARE, eyes wild and empty, seizes the screaming animal. He does not kill it first. He sinks his yellow teeth into its belly, ripping away at its skin and muscle, then begins to drink its blood greedily. The crowd falls silent, their initial delight turning to mute horror. TARRARE continues to eat, tearing off bits of raw flesh until only the white bones remain. After a while, between spasms of his body, he regurgitates the fur and skin of the unfortunate animal. He did the same with puppies, snakes, and eels. His performance was no longer a spectacle. It had become a sacrilegious ritual, a display of the most naked animal instincts in the heart of civilized society. He had become the very embodiment of fear, the very thing people wanted to look at and yet turn away from. But even the world of traveling circuses could not contain him for long. His hunger was too great, his behavior too unpredictable. He became a burden. Once again, he was abandoned, wandering alone. And then history knocked. The drums of the French Revolution beat across the land. Liberty, equality, fraternity became the slogan of the age. A new social order was established on the ashes of the old regime. In that upheaval, thousands of young men joined the Revolutionary Army, some out of ideology, some because they had nowhere else to go. TARRARE was one of them. A man shaped by the chaos of the streets would now enter the organized chaos of war. A new, more brutal stage awaited him. The French Revolutionary Army relied on discipline, patriotism, and strictly regulated rations. TARRARE had none of these, especially the last. To a war machine that needed uniformity and efficiency, he was a faulty cog, an incalculable variable. His hunger made no distinction between friend and foe, did not follow orders, and he immediately became a threat to the order of an entire regiment. His daily rations, though quadrupled compared to that of a normal soldier, were like a pebble thrown into an abyss. Hunger tormented him relentlessly. TARRARE became a ghost who roamed the barracks, doing odd jobs for other soldiers in exchange for a piece of bread or a portion of their food. When that was not enough, his most naked survival instincts kicked in. He began rummaging through the garbage, eating whatever others had thrown away. Records show that he ate rotten vegetables and rotten meat. But the height of his despair came when he was caught eating used bandages, cloth soaked in blood and pus, taken from the wounds of wounded soldiers. He even fought with wild dogs and rats in the sewers for food. His body, despite its extraordinary digestive powers, could not tolerate such a diet. He collapsed and was taken to the military hospital in Sault-Sainte-Reine. And it was here, in the controlled environment of a medical facility, that TARRARE's deformity ceased to be a burden. It became a phenomenon. He caught the eye of two of the most brilliant medical minds of the time, Dr. Corville and Baron Dominique Jean Larry, who was later named by Napoleon himself as the most virtuous soldier I have ever known. They didn't see a despicable glutton. They saw a window into the deepest secrets of human physiology. They decided to make TARRARE their primary subject. A series of experiments were conducted to determine his limits. The most famous, and the first, involved preparing a meal for 15 Masons. Picture the scene in a hospital room. A large table was set with 2 giant meat pies, plates of lard and salt, and 2 large pails of milk. 15 healthy men would have struggled to eat. TARRARE, under the watchful eyes of the doctors, sat down and began to eat. He ate greedily, without stopping, until everything on the table was gone. Soon his stomach was expanding like a full balloon. Sweat poured out of him, a visible heat rising from his body. He collapsed on the bed, falling into a deep sleep, wheezing like a well-fed animal. The doctors were stunned. They had seen the impossible. They continued their experiments, giving him live animals and taking meticulous notes. But their curiosity did not stop at observation. The war was raging. France needed every advantage it could get. Their scientific curiosity was satisfied, but their ambition was not. And Dr. Corville, the more pragmatic one, devised a new experiment, one not only to learn, but also to use. One day, he brought in a small wooden box, an inanimate object, but it was about to transform TARRARE from a medical experiment into an instrument of war, plunging him into an adventure whose danger and cruelty no hunger could match. The small wooden box was a test, but it was also a contract, one that TARRARE had no idea he had signed. By swallowing and safely excreting the box, he had proven that his body was more than a medical anomaly. It was a national asset, a mobile secret chamber, undetectable by any search. General Alexander de Beauharnais, a nobleman who had sided with the revolution and a commander of the Army of the Rhine, was convinced. In a world without radio or telegraph, sending a message across enemy lines was a life or death gamble. Couriers could be captured, tortured, and messages confiscated. But TARRARE, he was the perfect solution. He was a bioengineer, a human encryption machine. The plan was quickly formulated. TARRARE's first mission, to deliver a message to a French colonel being held by the Prussians near the town of Neustadt. The message would be placed in a familiar wooden box. TARRARE would swallow it, disguise himself as a German peasant, cross the border, find the colonel, and somehow deliver the box. The reward for success, if there was one, was designed to speak directly to his inner demons. Not gold, not glory. His reward was a wheelbarrow filled with 14 kilograms of raw beef lungs and liver. To a normal person, it was a disgusting sight. To TARRARE, it was heaven. The motivation had been set. On the morning of the mission, TARRARE swallowed the box. He was dressed in peasant clothes and released into the night with a blessing from Dr. Corville. But TARRARE's tragedy was that, while he could hide a box in his stomach, he could not hide himself. He did not know a word of German. His strange appearance, his furtive gait, and his eyes constantly darting around looking for something to eat made him a suspect at first sight. The German peasants actually shunned him, and within hours he was arrested by a Prussian patrol. The search began. They stripped him, searched every crevice of his body, but found nothing. They could not find a message hidden in the usual way. Furious, they began to beat him. But TARRARE, though in pain, would not talk. His loyalty was not to France. His fear was not for the Prussians. His greatest fear was failure, of returning empty-handed and facing hunger without reward. The Prussian commander, General Zoegli, was no fool. He noticed the prisoner's strange behavior, and although he could not imagine the truth, he suspected that the secret lay not in TARRARE, but in him. A doctor was called in, and after examining him, he concluded that there was a foreign object in the prisoner's stomach. Unable to remove him by force, the Prussians chose another tactic, one even more brutal than torture. They chained TARRARE to a latrine and fed him. They gave him plates of watery soup, pieces of bread, and then they waited. They didn't need to beat him anymore. They just needed to let nature take its course. Because the secret TARRARE carried, wrapped in wood and sealed by the resolve of the French army, couldn't be hidden forever. It had its own agenda, and the deadline was fast approaching. 30 hours. 30 hours in a filthy Prussian latrine, chained to the wall, with a military secret slowly creeping through his body and a hunger gnawing at his very bones. For TARRARE, it was a double hell. The physical pain from the beatings, the humiliation of the situation, and above all, the fear of what would happen next. And then, the moment came. The wooden box completed its journey through the biological maze of TARRARE. In disgust and excitement, the Prussian soldiers retrieved it. The box, though covered in excrement, was intact. It was washed and brought before General Zoegli, who waited with the impatience of a predator. There it was, the French secret, the key to turning the tide of battle, contained in a small wooden box, transported by an unimaginable method. The general carefully opened the box. His officers gathered around him holding their breath. Inside was a piece of paper. He carefully took it out. And then, his face changed from eagerness to confusion, and finally, to uncontrollable rage. The message contained no information about French troop numbers, positions, or strategies. It was simply a few lines, a note from Dr. Corville, asking if the box had arrived safely, and, if so, to send back some useful information about Prussian movements. It was a joke, a test. All this capture, torture and humiliating wait was just part of a French doctor's experiment. General Zoegli and his entire command staff had been turned into rats in the enemy's laboratory. The general's rage needed a place to vent, and there was no more suitable target than TARRARE, the deformed messenger who was shivering in a corner of the cell. TARRARE was dragged from his cell, not to freedom, but to face vengeance. He was dragged to the execution ground, where a gallows stood majestically under a gray sky. TARRARE did not understand what was happening, but he had a clear vision of the gallows. He began to scream, to beg in a language that was a mixture of French and the meaningless cries of an animal. A rough noose was placed around his neck. He could feel the weight of the rope, smell the scent of death. In that moment, his insatiable hunger vanished, replaced by a pure, primal terror. He was going to die, not from a bullet on the battlefield, but from a cruel joke. He closed his eyes, waiting for the plank beneath him to collapse, but never did. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, an officer cut the rope. TARRARE collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, tears and saliva streaming down his face. It was a play, a psychological torture staged to punish and humiliate him. General Zoegli, after giving TARRARE one last beating, roared at him to leave and never appear before him again. Beaten, humiliated, and broken, TARRARE was set free. He trudged across the border and back into France. He had survived, but the hungry demon inside him had now tasted something worse than hunger: deliberate human cruelty. He was no longer a medical wonder or a potential weapon. He was simply a damaged creature. He made his way back to the military hospital, to Baron Percy, not out of curiosity, but out of desperation. He fell to his knees, weeping, begging the doctor to cure him at all costs. He no longer wanted to be a weapon or a wonder. He just wanted to be a normal human being. But the question was, for a man who had gone this far, was there any way back? For the first time in his life, TARRARE wanted more than just to be fed. He wanted to be healed. His plea was not the cry of an empty stomach, but the cry of a soul broken to the limit. Baron Percy, a man of science but also of a kind heart, was moved. He decided that he would do everything in the power of 18th century medicine to extinguish the inferno inside his most unusual patient. The battle against the abyss began. They tried everything. TARRARE was given laudanum, a powerful form of opium, in the hope that it would quell his hunger. It didn't work. They gave him wine vinegar and crushed tobacco tablets, which were supposed to suppress his appetite. To no avail. In a desperate attempt, they fed him large amounts of hard-boiled eggs, hoping that a controlled, protein-rich diet would bring him some balance. TARRARE remained hungry. Each failure only added to the despair of both patient and doctor. Hunger was more than a symptom. It was an entity, an internal monster, and it was winning. No medicine, no prayer could touch it. And when it returned after failed attempts at treatment, it was more ferocious, more brazen, more demanding than before. TARRARE, confined within the hospital walls, turned the place into his own personal hunting ground. He no longer ate scraps. He began to hunt. When other patients were bled, a common treatment at the time, TARRARE would sneak in and drink their blood from the basins. When doctors discarded dirty bandages, he would rummage through them and eat them. But the real depravity begins when he discovers a plentiful supply, a place where death and silence reign: the hospital morgue. Several times, TARRARE was caught by hospital staff in the morgue in the middle of the night. They found him gnawing on cold bodies, ripping out organs. He had crossed a sacred line. He was no longer eating to survive. He was eating death itself. To the doctors and nurses, he was no longer a pitiful patient. He had become a living horror, a scavenger stalking the very place they were trying to save. Baron Percy's patience and compassion finally reached their limits. He still believed TARRARE was a patient suffering from some kind of mental illness, but the pressure from the other staff was too much. They threatened to leave the hospital if this monster was allowed to remain. And then, the worst happened, an event that turned disgust and fear into an undeniable accusation. A 14-month-old baby who was being treated in hospital disappeared from his crib without a trace. Chaos reigned. Nurses screamed. Doctors ran everywhere. The hospital was sealed off. A desperate search was launched, but to no avail. The child had vanished like vapor. But in everyone's mind, there was only one suspect. All eyes, all accusing fingers, pointed in one direction. To TARRARE, there was no evidence. No one had seen him do it, but his previous actions had become a verdict. How could a man who could eat corpses not harm a newborn baby? Vera and Percy tried to protect him one last time, but to no avail. The hospital crowd, furious and horrified, searched for TARRARE. He escaped just in time, but the doors of this last refuge in the world slammed shut in his face. Banished by the very people who had once tried to help him, TARRARE disappeared once more into the night, into the dark alleys of France. This time, he carried more than the curse of hunger. He carried an even darker shadow, the shadow of a child eater. Banished, accused, TARRARE was no longer just a deformity. He was a hunted specter, a monster in the eyes of society. He disappeared into the shadows of post-revolutionary France, a country still in turmoil of its own. History is silent about his fate for the next 4 years. For years, a black void in an already dark life. How did he survive? Did his hunger find new victims in the darkness? Did he become a hunter of the night, a wolf in human skin, living off unrecorded crimes? Or did he simply live the life of a beast, a scavenger, existing at the lowest ebb of human society? We will never know for sure. Those 4 years were his own, a secret he took to the grave. And then, in 1798, the ghost appeared again. A gaunt man, looking even more miserable than before, had presented himself to the hospital in Versailles. It was TARRARE, but the hellfire in his stomach seemed to have died down. He no longer screamed for food. His insatiable hunger had been replaced by another tormentor, an enemy from within. He was in the final stages of tuberculosis, and a constant bout of acute diarrhea was ravaging his decrepit body. A young doctor named Giroux de la Ville took him in, not with Percy's scientific curiosity, but with compassion for a dying creature. For weeks later, TARRARE, the man who had eaten a feast for 15 people, who had devoured live cats and clocks, died in his hospital bed at the age of 26. He had died not of starvation, but because his own body had rotted from the inside. But the story was not over yet. M. Tessier, a chief surgeon at the hospital who had known about TARRARE's case before, decided that this was the last chance for science to look inside this extraordinary man. He wanted to perform an autopsy. As soon as the shroud was opened, a terrible stench, an unbearable stench of death, filled the room. The other surgeons fled, but Tessier, with the courage of a true scientist, stayed. He wanted to see the truth, and the truth was more terrifying than he could have imagined. When Tessier opened TARRARE's mouth, he could see a tube leading almost straight down to the stomach. The entire esophagus was abnormally wide. His jaw could be opened unnaturally, almost dislocated. But that was just the surface. When the abdominal cavity was opened, the scene inside was a hell of putrefaction. His liver and gallbladder were abnormally large and in a state of gangrene. But the most shocking thing was the stomach. It was huge, loose, sagging, and took up most of the space in the abdomen. Its surface was covered with ulcers and patches of pus. His entire digestive system was a mess of decay, a biological machine eating itself. The stench became unbearable. Even a hardened man like Tessier was forced to give up. The autopsy had to be stopped midway. TARRARE's final mystery, one that may have been in his nervous system or the structure of his brain, was buried with his rotting body. Science had a chance to understand him, and once again, it failed. It was repelled by the very horror it was trying to understand. TARRARE, even in death, remains an untouchable mystery. The autopsy failed. The curtain fell. TARRARE, dead, carried his secret to the grave, shrouded in a stench too horrible for science to penetrate. He had come into this world as a riddle, and he would leave as a riddle. In the more than 2 centuries since, modern medicine has tried to look back and offer belated diagnoses. Some have suggested that TARRARE suffered from a severe form of hyperthyroidism, a condition that can cause a frenetic metabolism, constant sweating, and intense hunger. Others have pointed to damage to the amygdala or hypothalamus in his brain, the centers that control satiety and the instinct to eat. A rare genetic condition called Prader-Willi syndrome has also been considered. Each of these theories might explain some of the puzzle, but none of them can explain the whole thing. No diagnosis can adequately explain his ability to swallow large objects without choking, his ability to digest almost anything, and the sheer scale of his hunger that seems to come from another dimension. TARRARE remains an exception, a unique case, a challenge to our understanding of a human body. But perhaps to understand TARRARE, we must look beyond medicine. We must look to the times in which he lived. He was a perfect product of chaos, born into the abject poverty of feudal France, found a role in the ruthless world of traveling circuses and the curious, turned into a tool by the cold pragmatism of an army at war, and finally, shunned by the very society that had once intrigued and exploited him. Throughout his short and tragic life, TARRARE was treated as anything but human. To the crowd, he was a spectacle. To the doctors, he was an experiment. To the generals, he was a weapon. The question of whether he ate the child, while horrifying, is perhaps misplaced. The larger question is, who is the real monster in this story? A man tormented by an uncontrollable disease? Or a society that looked upon his suffering and saw only amusement or profit? TARRARE's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. It is not just about physical hunger. It is a metaphor for human hungers themselves. The hunger of the masses for the bizarre and the sensational. The hunger of science for knowledge, sometimes at the expense of morality. The hunger of war for new tools, however inhumane. Ultimately, the story of TARRARE is not about a man who could eat the world. It is about a world that tried to devour a man in many ways, and finally, when it had no more use for him, spat him out and left him to die in oblivion. His grave has no headstone, no memorial. A complete silence, as if society wanted to erase any trace of the existence of a phenomenon that had embarrassed and shamed them. TARRARE is a dark corner of history, a reminder that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and that the greatest horrors come not from ghosts or supernatural forces. They come from the fragile limits of the human body, and from the bottomless abyss in how we treat one another.